Toni Morrison's 1977 Song of Solomon is an intensely lyrical, achingly beautiful masterpiece of Southern Gothic, magical realist, postmodern African-American literature that follows one man's quest to uncover the secrets of his family's history in order to learn the truth of who he really is. Morrison wrote this book in the wake of her father's death as a way of communicating with him from beyond the grave about really deep personal themes. She channeled her father's spirit. Her father became her muse, and the main question that she put to him was, what are the men you have known really like? And this book is the answer. And you can really tell that this work comes from a place of love and loss. There is an overwhelming sense of sincerity, and there is a deep wisdom running through this novel. A kind of wisdom about the human condition that you cannot obtain without pain. And I personally find this book to be really valuable and deeply instructive and spiritually nourishing. Along with that, one of the things that I really love about this gorgeous masterwork is that it offers us a richly layered narrative tapestry that is lusciously visual, strikingly musical. It's incredibly melodic. It is also deeply metaphorical and allegorical. There is a great cognitive power in this work. This coming of age story is about spiritual redemption. It's about race. It's about love. It's about self-acceptance and freedom. It's about freeing oneself from the mental bonds that keep us trapped. And what I really love is that Morrison achieves a great complexity by weaving her novel together from a wide variety of different cultural myths. We have stories and symbols from the biblical tradition riven through this narrative. Of course, that's quite obvious. You can see that right there in the title. We have stories taken from African folklore, stories that have been passed down in the oral tradition. We've got the sound of blues, jazz, and gospel song running through this work as well. We have fairy tales comprising different aspects of this tapestry, and we also have the Homeric, we have the heroic, and we have the mythic. There's a great mythic structure in this work. And on top of all of that, Morrison is simultaneously adding herself to the American tradition, even whilst she sublimely critiques it and subverts it. And it's really not hard to see why Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993. She was the first black woman of any nationality to win the prize, which was awarded to her to mark her novel's power to deliver visionary force and poetic import, giving life to an essential aspect of American reality. After the Nobel win, Song of Solomon was chosen by Oprah for her book club in 1996, which thrust Toni Morrison's works into the hands of millions of readers. Overnight, Oprah would actually go on to choose 4 of Morrison's works for her book club, adding Paradise, The Bluest Eye, and Sula over the course of 6 years. And Winfrey would say, "For all those who have asked the question, Toni Morrison again? I say with certainty there would have been no Oprah's book club if this woman had not chosen to share her love of words with the world." And honestly, Oprah could have chosen many more of Morrison's works for her book club, because they are all incredibly resonant and rewarding reads. And when first-time readers fall in love with Toni Morrison's work, they will want to go on to devour the rest of her oeuvre. They will be thinking about the next Morrison book they want to read even before they have finished the one they are reading. And I think Song of Solomon is the perfect place to start for getting into Toni Morrison. I also think it's her master work. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And talking of book club readings, we are now reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We are kicking off a deep read through and lecture series to help guide you through the work, to increase your appreciation of the narrative, to help you get in touch with the characters, and to start to take their concerns on as your own and to wrangle with the profound themes in this book. And ultimately, by the end of our read through, we will have found ourselves profoundly changed for the better. So today, let's talk about how to read Song of Solomon. Now, I want to tell you about the story and the characters who are superbly and sublimely crafted, and I will do so in a moment, and I will be mindful of spoilers. I don't want to give anything away because Song of Solomon, in my opinion, is a lyrical soap opera. That's how I would describe it. And much of the thrill of a first-time reading of this book is seeing how the characters develop, seeing the interplay of these different protagonists and what they want versus what they need, seeing the different power dynamics, seeing their different motivations and how they either change or don't change and what they represent philosophically. So we'll talk about that, and we are also going to explore the central conceit at the core of the novel. The central motif is that of flight, and this is very, very important. We're going to talk about that and the chilling origin of a really powerful African slave mythology. But first, let's start by talking about the genre and explaining some of the terminology that I used at the beginning of this talk, because I'm absolutely fascinated with how great writers bend, blend, subvert, and work within generic expectations. And Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon is pure Southern Gothic. And what does that mean? The Southern Gothic is a subgenre of the Gothic form. The Gothic is the overarching form, and I absolutely adore the Gothic form. It's one of my favourites. I love the genre. And although Gothic elements go very, very far back, we can see elements of the Gothic in the oldest tales. The Gothic truly exploded as a form of popular entertainment across Europe in response to the horrors and the terrors of the French Revolution. At the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we've spoken about the French Revolution in depth with many novels. Essentially, there was a rising up against the aristocracy, and royalist heads were rolling in the streets. The guillotine was being pulled out and people were being murdered. They were being executed by the rebels who had had enough of the exploitation by the upper classes. And after a few years of chaos and bloodshed, of course, Napoleon comes in to try to take order. The Gothic responded to the bloodshed of the French Revolution by delivering tales. Writers who wrote in the Gothic mode, they gave us tales of horrors taking place in old, antiquated structures, in antiquated spaces. Think castles and crypts and crumbling abbeys, for example. Think graveyards, yeah? Gothic ultimately springs from romance as a form, and romance doesn't mean love. It doesn't mean love stories, although love is a part of romance, but romance means ultimately quest narrative or adventure story. So if you're reading something that's Gothic, then you are ultimately reading a quest narrative most of the time as well, in which the protagonist must go on a journey and they are seeking something. They're seeking to learn something, typically about themselves, typically about their identity. And the really interesting thing about the Gothic is that although it takes place in antiquated spaces, it always has something to tell us about the present, about the contemporary time. My tutor back at Oriel College, James Methven, he would say that the Gothic's exploration of the past is always a comment on the present and the contemporary political scene. You can probably see why the revolution was such an influence, because that's what the revolution was. It was a violent dethroning of the old holders of power. It was a questioning of these old power structures. So you've got antiquated spaces, and then you've also got a really macabre, grotesque and spooky otherworldly atmosphere going on. In Gothic stories, there's an exploration of the supernatural that typically takes the form of ghosts and spirits. It can be all sorts of different things. Typically there's evil lurking around the corner. Now, the Southern Gothic, which is compounded with dark romanticism, keeps that element of the supernatural, because that's really important. You want a supernatural atmosphere, you want a sense of the otherworldly. It keeps that, and the perennial concern about how the past weighs heavily upon the present. And indeed, if there were a biblical formulation for the Gothic, it would be this: the sins of the fathers will be inherited by the next generation. The Southern Gothic keeps all of that, but it transposes the locale. It takes all of that over to the American South. So rather than using the form as an exploration or a political commentary on the power structures of pre-revolutionary Europe, the commentary in the Southern Gothic is always about the crumbling and decaying of Southern aristocracy. So the Southern locales include states like Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, to name just a few. And if you want an example of a writer who works within the Southern Gothic mode and is a sublime representative of it, then William Faulkner is a really excellent writer to explore. You can read his A Rose for Emily. It's a short story. You can read that if you want a very quick way of getting a sense of what the Southern Gothic's all about. Faulkner's a sublime representation of the Southern Gothic, and there is a high Faulknerian strain in the writings of Toni Morrison. Indeed, if you want a quick way to conceptualise what the prose of Toni Morrison is like for a first-time reader, well, it's kind of like a fusion between William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. That will give you a close approximation of Toni Morrison's craft. Along with Faulkner, one also thinks of Flannery O'Connor when it comes to the Southern Gothic. Read her short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and I will be providing links for everything that I mention in the resource section for this discussion at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. And along the journey, as we read through this book together, I'm going to be encouraging joyful extracurricular secondary reading. So we will come out of Song of Solomon having not only read this one novel, but having read many different things. And we'll become acquainted with American short stories, African mythology, fairy tales, myth, and much more. So Faulkner, O'Connor, and also Carson McCullers. And this is a writer that I've personally only just started reading recently, and I'm very excited about it. After our recent top 50 books video, if you haven't checked that out, then check it out. It was a good chat. So many readers implored me to read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, telling me that if I love Southern Gothic, I should absolutely read this book, and they are so right. I am absolutely loving it. So, the Southern Gothic has a US Southern locale, a setting, but with a dark atmosphere of decay that symbolises moral decay. And if you want a really great example of how the Southern Gothic conceptualises the shift from the old to the new South, then check out Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire. A great play. I would highly recommend the Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh film version directed by Elia Kazan. The Southern Gothic focuses on the South's history of racism, slavery, and violence, and the settings will often include plantations. And indeed, if you want to read a great book by Toni Morrison that tackles the issue of slavery head-on, then I highly recommend her Beloved. I'm not sure that's the first one someone should start with when they're first getting into Morrison. Masterwork though it is, just because of the challenges with its experimental prose style, I think Song of Solomon's a better place to start. Although this has some experimentalism and some challenges, some time distortion, non-linear narrative and postmodern devices as well. And what about the characters in these works in the Southern Gothic? Well, they are often grotesque and they typically have deep psychological flaws. In fact, often they have physical deformities as well. They might be unstable mentally, and they typically have a dubious sense of morality, and they are wrestling with that in the narrative. Often characters in the Southern Gothic form are outlaws, outcasts, misfits, and the marginalised, and Morrison is all about writing about the marginalised, and we'll get into that more in a moment when we talk about her thoughts on race and gender. Morrison, with her Song of Solomon, ticks all of the Southern Gothic boxes with her locale, her themes, her characters, and she chooses to set her narrative in the span of time between 1931 and 1963. Indeed, Morrison herself was born in 1931, and her central protagonist is also born in 31. Choosing to run the book up to 1963, but not going into 64 is deliberate, because that keeps the action of the narrative in the America of racial segregation. Yeah, so we are seeing a time that spans from the Harlem Renaissance, and Toni Morrison was massively influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. This was a golden age of black art in the United States. It was a really exciting time. And then when we get to 1964, we have the end to racial segregation in the United States. The thing about Jim Crow laws is that they were essentially slavery by another name. Jim Crow laws refer to the legal codification of racial segregation that dominated the American South, though northern states of course had their own forms of racial segregation and entrenched discrimination. The slaves were formally freed in 1865, June 19th. This day is celebrated as Juneteenth. And this means, of course, that Morrison's great-grandparents, like the grandparents of her central protagonist, were freed slaves. So that's in the personal history. That's what exploring one's personal history for African Americans often looks like. That means Morrison's not too distant ancestors and those of her central protagonist knew a life in which they had no liberty. The American dream was closed to black Americans who weren't considered men, they were considered property, up until 1865. And then they knew a life where they were supposedly freed, but of course denied extensive rights across the board. They were denied the same rights as white people. Everything from education to public services to voting to medicine needed massive reform. 1964 is the date of the Civil Rights Act, which finally made segregation illegal. This comes off the back of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. This comes off the back of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat for a white person on a bus, and many more who blazed the trail for civil rights along the way. This came off the back of many black men and women being murdered by white lynch mobs and the lynch mobs being pardoned from prosecution. Things finally reached fever pitch and long overdue change was finally brought in. Song of Solomon ends right before this date. That's the period of time that Morrison is detailing. So, along with being soaked in the Southern Gothic form, Morrison is also crafting her story with a deep awareness of African American slave narratives in mind, and as she does so, she is also working superbly in the key of magical realism, which I personally see as the primary literary mode of the 20th century, particularly in Latin American literature, like with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I'm actually reading that at the moment and I find it to be an intoxicating masterpiece. Though of course British Indian Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, that is another exemplary example of the mode of magical realism. Now, in an interview with the Paris Review, and again I'll link this over at the Bookclub at patreon.com/hardcore literature, Morrison says that she used to be surprised when people compared her to the magical realists because it doesn't mean anything to me, she says. Schools are only important to me when I'm teaching literature. She was a professor of literature. It doesn't mean anything to me when I'm sitting here with a big pile of blank yellow paper. What do I say? I'm a magical realist? Each subject matter demands its own form, she would say. And we'll talk about this more in a moment because Morrison did not like to be labelled, and one can definitely understand that. Regardless of that, she is still exemplary of that genre, and many more genres. She's as exemplary when it comes to magical realism as she is when it comes to Southern Gothic. What is magical realism though? It sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Now, the difference between romance and realism is that romance is that which could never happen, whilst realism is that which may or might happen or could happen. Magical realism is the sublime blending of the two. And that means in a magical realist story, you get everyday scenarios, you get situations and places, locales that you recognise, that you're familiar with. It depicts everyday life, typically with a really exquisite attention to detail. Typically magical realist stories are very vivid and they can often be very, very visual. What happens is in magical realism you'll get a blend of the everyday and realistic with the kinds of things that can only happen in the realm of imagination. They seamlessly blend together. So in magical realist novels, people might be be able to fly. People might be able to communicate with the natural world or with forces beyond this world, with ghosts, for example. Or there might be a strange distortion of temporality. And all of these features are taken for granted as real rather than fantastical by the protagonists. Magical realism is also often a vehicle for wrangling with issues of marginalisation, social injustice and identity. These are all things that Morrison explores superbly in her work. And magical realism is a really great genre for political and historical and cultural commentary. Very often, when you're writing in the magical realist key, you can really get away with critiquing systems of power, whilst also simultaneously interweaving a deep exploration, a deep loving exploration of folklore and myth and legend in a really symbolic and beautiful way. Once again, Morrison does all of this. And very often magical realist stories end up feeling very timeless, yeah? Although they make comments on the contemporary, just like the Gothic, they end up transcending the contemporary and giving voice to evergreen concerns. And it's really not hard to see the relationship between magical realism and African American folklore and how they blend in the modern consciousness when we consider the slave narratives that Morrison was inspired by. In many of the works of African American writers dealing with issues of race, prejudice, civil rights, and the history of slavery, we see that there is a great sense of movement in these works. There's physical and external movement, but there's also internal movement, emotional and spiritual movement. And the movement is from slavery to freedom, from bondage to emancipation. Slave narratives are escape narratives. And the physical movement in these narratives, or those that are inspired by them, is typically that of journeying from the south of the US to the north. And when you have a modern writer who's inspired by these slave narratives, they typically mimic this movement in imitation, in homage, in recall of the progression of slave narratives who would escape their southern plantations to a life of more freedom and potential up in the northern states. Many of which had voted to abolish slavery before the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. In New York, for example, the governor signed an act to gradually end slavery in 1799, but full emancipation would only occur in 1827. This is still decades before many of the southern states. Now, one of the most famous slave narratives is the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and his physical movement from the south to the north aligns with a metaphysical movement. Ralph Ellison was inspired by this for his 1953 novel Invisible Man, and Toni Morrison was inspired by Ellison, though her creative offering, whilst dealing with the same themes, does so in a very different way. We see in Ellison's novel, for example, his central unnamed protagonist moves from Greenwood, South Carolina up to Harlem, New York, which also traces the path of thousands of Southern black Americans who moved north in the 20th century in the 1930s and 40s in search of better opportunities during the Great Migration. And if you want to read Invisible Man, by the way, we have a lecture series which is available on demand at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. And I highly recommend it because I think it's one of the best American novels of the 20th century and it's one of my personal favourites. It's very Whitmanian. It's beautiful. What Morrison does in Song of Solomon is she reverses this south to north journey, and her protagonist, Milkman Dead, yes, I know, that's a very strange name, but we'll come to that in a moment. Milkman Dead instead begins his journey in the upper Midwest region of the country, in an unnamed industrial city in Michigan, which is often read as a stand-in for Detroit, the birthplace of Motown. He moves from Michigan to the fictional town of Shalimar, which is pronounced Shalimon, and this is a play on words of Solomon. He travels to this fictional town as part of his journey of discovery in Virginia. Now, geographically, we move all over the place in Song of Solomon, and we also move back and forth in time, and we move all over the place via physical wanderings and also just the memories of different characters. We get a real mix of US cities cities and towns. The setting for most of Morrison's novels is the Midwest, which is inspired by her own upbringing in Lorain, Ohio, an area of the country which Morrison describes as neither ghetto nor plantation. Talking about her research into slave narratives in an interview for her Beloved, by the way, Morrison would say, "I wouldn't read them for information because I knew they had to be authenticated by white patrons, that they couldn't say everything they wanted to say because they couldn't alienate their audience. They had to be quiet about certain things. They were going to be as good as they could be under the circumstances and as revelatory, but they never say how terrible it was. They just say, well, you know, it was really awful, but let's abolish slavery so life can go on." The narratives had to be very understated. So while I looked at the documents and felt familiar with slavery and overwhelmed by it, I wanted it to be truly felt. I wanted to translate the historical into the personal. I spent a long time trying to figure out what it was about slavery that made it so repugnant, so personal, so indifferent, so intimate, and yet so public. Now, to really understand Song of Solomon, which follows this central protagonist, Milkman Dead's journeying, his travelling south to learn about his identity and his past, his family history, we have to talk about the myth of flying Africans. We're going to unpick a lot of really fascinating disparate influences in our lecture series at Patreon. We'll talk about the Mwindo African epic. We'll talk about different fairy tales like Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel. We'll investigate those parallels as we read through at the book club. We'll talk about the heroic monomyth. We'll talk about Homer's Odyssey. And we'll also talk about biblical parallels like the parable of the prodigal son from Luke. But from the outset, what you really need to know is that central to Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison is drawing from, or she is inspired by, African folkloric stories about slaves flying back to Africa. And when I say flying, I mean literally flying, escaping their captors and flying home, either growing wings or literally turning into birds. In interviews, Morrison has said that in her community, with the people she was growing up with, people she spoke to, they would believe in ghosts, for example. There was a strong belief in the supernatural, and it's funny, it's only recently, historically speaking, that a lot of the Western world has fallen out of supernatural belief, but I would actually wager and say most of the world does still have religious, mythical, mystical and supernatural belief, but for the longest time even scientists and the highest intellectual elites, doctors, they all believed in ghosts and witches, they all believed in spirits. But Morrison would say in her community people literally believed in ghosts even if they hadn't seen one. They would say, well, I know someone who has seen one, so I believe in ghosts. But she would say that they also believed literally in the story of their slave ancestors flying across the Atlantic and escaping their captors. There was a sense with this story that my great-grandfather was able to fly home, there was a sense that this was not symbolic or metaphorical or allegorical. Just like with the Bible, many people took it literally. And indeed, there is some truth there, and there can be great utility in literally believing in what is ostensibly or potentially metaphorical. If you believe fully in the allegorical and metaphorical, then often powerful and magical and miraculous things start to happen in your life. Morrison would say, the one thing you say about a myth is that there's some truth in there, no matter how bizarre they may seem. Kierkegaard would say this. Kierkegaard, who said, ultimately, yes, everything's absurd, the idea, the notion of God and a spiritual belief, it's an absurd, so we just have to leap into faith. We have to take a leap of faith. That's what faith is. We don't know, but we leap into it. He would say that because things like the Bible are so absurd, there has to be some truth there. We talk about things being absurdly true. In Song of Solomon, multiple characters are depicted as being in flight in some sense throughout the novel. Indeed, the story begins with a flight, it ends with a flight. It's buttressed by flights. Indeed, the first flight we see is a suicide leap. A man jumps from a building and kills himself after a vain attempt at flight. But flight is on the lips of many of the characters. My favourite protagonist in the book is a woman called Pilate. She says, you want to fly? You got to give up the shit that weighs you down. Flight can represent many things, good and bad. It can symbolize escape, seeking for freedom, a leaving behind of the ones we love, or a self-transcendence. But one of the main flights underpinning this novel is the idea of a literal flight back home. Where did this story of African slaves flying home originate? Well, many will see the origin of this myth in the mass suicide of 1803 at Igbo Landing in Georgia. Igbo people are the ethnic people of Nigeria. They were taken captive with the intention of auctioning them off in Savannah at the local slave markets. 75 of them on board had been bought for $100 each to work on the plantations. The slavers didn't like dealing with the Igbo people because they had a reputation well earned for being ferocious and for fiercely resisting their captivity. They did not go down without a fight, and on this day in 1803 they definitely did not go down without a fight. They took control of the ship and they killed their captors, they drowned them, they refused to submit themselves to the slavery of the United States. They rose up, they drowned their ship, and then what happened next has several versions. There are several versions of what happened during the revolt, but apparently they went to the shore and under the direction of the Igbo High Chief, as they sung in their language, they sung about how the water spirit brought them here and the water spirit will bring them home. They decided to choose death over slavery, death as freedom, and they walked en masse into the swampy creek and drowned themselves. And local people would go on to report hauntings by the souls of the dead enslaved but now free Igbo around the surrounding marsh area. That's where we think the flying African myth probably originated from. By the mid-1930s, oral narrative sources were being committed to written record, and this prominent myth had by that point been passed down by word of mouth generationally over the course of more than a century since the event, and in the African American consciousness, their ancestors had developed wings and had flown back to Africa. Zora Neale Hurston detailed a Jamaican version in Tell My Horse, because yes, it's prevalent in African American culture, but in Caribbean American culture too. We see also this notion in Ralph Ellison's short story Flying Home. We see it in the Book of Folklore, edited by Langston Hughes and Anna Bontemps. For a recent children's book manifestation, you can check out Virginia Hamilton's The People Could Fly. Talking about myth, Toni Morrison would say, I think the myths are misunderstood now because we are not talking to each other the way I was spoken to when I was growing up in a very small town. You knew everything in that little microcosm. But we don't live where we were born. I had to leave my town to do my work here. It was a great sacrifice. There is a certain sense of family I don't have, so the myths get forgotten. Or they may not have been looked at carefully. Let me give you an example. The flying myth in Song of Solomon. If it means Icarus to some readers, fine. I want to take credit for that. But my meaning is specific. It is about black people who could fly. That was always part of the folklore of my life. Flying was one of our gifts. I don't care how silly it may seem, it is everywhere. People used to talk about it. It's in the spirituals and gospels. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, escape, death, and all that, but suppose it wasn't. What might it mean? I tried to find out in Song of Solomon. Now, at the heart of this quest narrative, in which the central protagonist quests to discover their true identity, is a profound comment on the power of names and the act of naming itself, and resisting or embracing or overturning the names that are thrust upon us. Our central protagonist's quest is initially material, yeah? But over the course of his journey, he learns something metaphysical, he learns something much more valuable. He learns about who he really is. The very first thing you notice when you read this book, I think, is that the names can be quite strange for a lot of readers. Not everybody, but for some readers they can be a little bit of a difficulty getting into the work. Now, we might say that this is very estranging, yeah? The Russian formalists would talk of defamiliarization. That's when they would attempt to refresh the reader's perceptions so that they see old things anew in a different light. And although Toni Morrison, as a postmodernist writer, is definitely keen to defamiliarise, that's not what she's doing primarily with her names. They're not chosen just to refresh our perceptions. They're chosen because they are legitimately and sincerely making a comment on the act of naming itself. Their names mean something, and Morrison knew that names tell stories. If you find out your true name, we're told in the novel, you should hang on to it because it tells you who you are. And one of the characters, Pilate, does exactly that. She keeps a copy of her name in a box, in an earring, and it hangs from her ear. She hangs on to her name. Names are also records of history and community. They can keep a community together. They can create communal cohesion. We see the power that names have from the outset of the narrative. We get a really funny, playful social commentary, a playful but profound social commentary when it comes to one of the street names that the characters live on. So the central protagonist is Milkman Dead, and his mother, Ruth, she was daughter to the first wealthy and influential black man in the neighbourhood. He was a black doctor called Dr. Foster. Now, because this doctor was such a prominent member of the black community, the people wanted to honour that. They wanted to celebrate that. So they called their street Doctor Street. Originally, it was called Mains Avenue, and the government officials, aware of the power of names, insisted on keeping it as Main Street, not Doctor Street. They didn't want to give the black community any pride or identity, so what did the community en masse do? They mocked the powers that be, and they basically said, well, if you're going to try to efface black culture, part of black culture will contain that attempt to efface it. It will contain it within it. It will embrace that. We'll just roll right with that, and we'll keep our identity alive and flourishing. Maybe we will even define ourselves, define our living as your attempt to deny our living. You tried to kill us, you tried to suppress us, you tried to enslave us. We're still here. So what do they call the street? They all refer to the street as not Doctor Street. They say, have it your way. Okay, it's not Doctor Street. And so the name of the street is not Doctor Street. So there's a really perceptive comment in this book. Names are not arbitrary. Names influence how people think and indeed what they think. We know this from the linguistic theory of relativity. Language influences thought, not the other way around. Why is censorship a thing? Why is suppression of free speech a thing? It's because people know that the pen is mightier than the sword. This is absolutely true. If you suppress what people can say, you suppress what they can think. Do not be deterred by the strange names in this novel, because once you get to know the characters, you will find that you are reading this novel for them. You are reading for these characters. You do get to know them and you take on their concerns as your own. But let's have a look at some of these character names. We have Milkman Dead. He's our central protagonist, or indeed he is Macon III, named after his father Macon, who was named after his grandfather Macon. Milkman is not his real name. It is a nickname because he was overseen still breastfeeding at kind of too old of an age, and so he was given that rather sordid and strange moniker, and that has become his identity. Milkman's aunt is named Pilate. Yes, that's right, that is the guy who crucified Christ. And if you're interested in the historicity of Christ, then we had a really deep discussion on this as part of our Bulgakov lecture series, which is available at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. So Pilate is named after the Christ killer, and that's ironic, and there's a lot of subversion going on there, and it's really interesting. And Pilate's daughters are called Hagar and Reba. Milkman's mother, Ruth, her daughters, or Milkman's sisters, are called First Corinthians and Magdalene called Lena. And Milkman also has a friend called Guitar. And why is he called Guitar? Is he really, really good at the guitar? No, it's because when he was a child, he kind of expressed a little bit of interest in having a guitar. That's it. So what do you notice about these names? They seem a bit random, don't they? Well, many of them are randomly chosen, literally randomly chosen from the Bible. And this is the naming process that's explored in this book. The black protagonists will flip to a random page in the Bible, and wherever their finger lands on the day of their child's birth, that's the child's name. Now, this is very similar to the slavers' process of naming. They would name them at random too. And Toni Morrison's mother, and indeed Toni Morrison's own name, her full real name is Chloe Mary Anthony Wofford, her mother's name, Rama, was plucked blind from the Bible. This is a real practice. Speaking of the Bible, of course, as you may have noticed, the title Song of Solomon is a direct allusion to the Song of Solomon in the Bible. This is a sublimely erotic poem. It's a collection of lyrics that gives voice to the romantic and sexual yearnings and longings of two lovers. And Morrison's novel explores sexual and romantic love too, but she explores much more than that. She explores familial love, and she explores, really importantly, self-love. So Milkman Dead. So his first name, that's a nickname, it's not fantastic, but his last name, Dead, is the result of a mistake passed down the generations. What's that all about? Well, it's highly symbolic. Milkman, we see, feels like he's dead, feels like he's the walking dead, feels like he's not living, he feels like he's trapped. Names, as much as they can liberate us if they are our true name, can also keep us feeling confined. He is trapped and confined to the life of his father and potentially his grandfather. He's a walking dead man. Let me read you where this name came from the book, and I want to read you the passage in which Pilate gets her name too, because I absolutely love these passages. Macon tells his son Milkman that Papa couldn't read, couldn't even sign his name, had a mark he used, and everything bad that ever happened to him happened because he couldn't read. Got his name messed up because he couldn't read. His name? How? When freedom came, all the coloured people in the state had to register with the Freedmen's Bureau. Your father was a slave? What kind of foolish question is that? Of course he was. Who hadn't been in 1869? They all had to register, free and not free, free and used to be slaves. Papa was in his teens and went to sign up, but the man behind the desk was drunk. He asked Papa where he was born. Papa said Macon. Then he asked him who his father was. Papa said, he's dead. Asked him who owned him. Papa said, I'm free. Well, the Yankee wrote it all down, but in the wrong spaces. Had him born in Dunfree, wherever the hell that is, and in the space for his name, the fool wrote dead, comma, Macon. But Papa couldn't read, so he never found out what he was registered as till Mama told him. They met on a wagon going north, started talking about one thing and another, told her about being a freedman and showed off his papers to her. When she looked at his paper, she read him out what it said. He didn't have to keep the name, did he? He could have used his real name, couldn't he? Mama liked it, liked the name, said it was new and would wipe out the past, wipe it all out. What was his real name? I don't remember my mother too well. She died when I was 4. And this was a man that when it came to the birth of his daughter, Pilate, the girl who would be called Pilate, his wife tragically died in childbirth, tragically died giving birth to her. We're told he had cooperated as a young father with the blind selection of names from the Bible for every child other than the first male, and abided by whatever the finger pointed to, for he knew every configuration of the naming of his sister. How his father, confused and melancholy over his wife's death in childbirth, had thumbed through the Bible, and since he could not read a word, chose a group of letters that seemed to him strong and handsome, saw in them a large figure that looked like a tree, hanging in some princely but protective way over a row of smaller trees. How he had copied the group of letters out on a piece of brown paper, copied as illiterate people do, every curlicue, arch and bend in the letters, and presented it to the midwife. That's the baby's name. You want this for the baby's name? I want that for the baby's name. Say it. You can't name the baby this. Say it. It's a man's name. Say it. Pilate. What? Pilate. You wrote down Pilate. Like a riverboat pilot. No, not like a riverboat pilot. Like a Christ-killing pilot. You can't get much worse than that for a name, and a baby girl at that. That's where my finger went down at. Well, your brain ain't got to follow it. You don't want to give this motherless child the name of the man that killed Jesus, do you? I asked Jesus to save me my wife. Careful, Macon. I asked him all night long. He give you your baby. Yes, he did. Baby named Pilate. Jesus have mercy. Like I said, it's a real lyrical soap opera. I love the dialogue. I think her characters, Toni Morrison's characters, are superb, and her prose is also exquisite. But it really is fantastic when we get to a stretch of dialogue. You can really see the characters. It's like a film. Somebody needs to make a film out of this. The thing is, for some first-time readers, it might take a little bit of time to get into the book, and I would really encourage people to stick with it for 80 to 100 pages at least. At least stick with it until you meet Pilate. She's my favourite character, and then you will really get to know the characters and it will pay off. Now, I got into this really quickly when I first read it, but I can understand why it might take people, I'd say 60 to 80 pages before you start getting really interested in it, but it's so worth it, purely because the characters are so fantastic. When it comes to Pilate, for example, she's such a fantastic character. There's this real tension between her and her brother because he thinks she has betrayed him. I'm not going to go into plot with this, I'm really not. I want it to be a surprise for you. But he thinks one thing, she knows another. It's the same with his wife. He's quite abusive with his wife. We get to see both sides of the story there. Pilate is a woman who has been told by the ghost of her father to sing, although there's a secret lurking in there that I'm not going to get into, but she thinks she's been told to sing, and so she spends her life singing. Morrison would say that she had to stop Pilate from speaking so much in the novel because this was a character who ultimately got away from her. She has this long conversation with the two boys, that's Milkman and Guitar, but after that I had to stop her from speaking, otherwise she would overwhelm everybody. She got terribly interesting, and I had to take my book back. It's my book. It's not called Pilate. She's a fascinating character. Her daughters are fascinating. The interplay is fascinating. Guitar is a very interesting character. Him and Milkman have these Dostoevskian sort of philosophical questions about justice. Guitar essentially turns Punisher. Yeah, he is really angry about the killing of black people by white Americans, and we get this real Old Testament eye for an eye versus New Testament discourse between him and Milkman. We also get this comment on how white on black violence then feeds into black on black violence, and it gets really heavy. This was, remember, a time in which Martin Luther King was giving voice to distress felt throughout the black community. This was the time of Malcolm X, and indeed I think that Guitar is definitely influenced by Malcolm X. These are just a few details of a few characters. They're all fantastic, and I do implore you to really get to know the characters, speak to them and hear what they have to say to you. Now, in writing about the concerns of black people and people of colour, Morrison's books opened up a whole new world of recognition for so many readers. So many readers finally found a kindred spirit in her works. I've heard so many different readers from different backgrounds, but definitely black women, who said that growing up they were reading books with characters that didn't really look like them. They were reading books where the heroines were blonde or blue-eyed, they were white girls, and so coming to Toni Morrison's books was like a revelation. Finally they felt heard or seen, and it was great to have someone that they recognised, who they could relate to. And of course, because she writes about the black community, this inevitably led to swathes of the critical reading public from the 70s onwards asking Morrison the question, when are you going to stop writing about race? Are you going to write about something else? And there's a really great interview with Charlie Rose in which she responds to this tired question, essentially saying, would people ask James Joyce, why does he always write about Irish people? She said in a Salon magazine interview, no one says Solzhenitsyn is writing only about those Russians. I mean, what's the matter with him? Why doesn't he write about Vermont? She says, it's very important to me that my work be African American. If it assimilates into a different or larger pool, so much the better, but I shouldn't be asked to do that. Joyce is not asked to do that. Tolstoy is not, and Toni Morrison is influenced by both of these writers. She talks of reading Finnegan's Wake with great joy and glee and laughing all the way through it. She's very Tolstoyic at times, she's very Dostoevskian at times. Her point is completely true, and it exposes the absurdity of that question in the first place. She says, I mean, they can all be Russian, French, Irish or Catholic. They write out of where they come from, and I do too. It just so happens that that space for me is African American. It could be Catholic, it could be Midwestern. I'm those things too, and they are all important. But when people ask me that question, she says, when are you going to stop writing about race? Can you write about something else? I don't think they actually mean that. I think they mean, are you ever going to write a book about white people? For them, perhaps that's a kind of compliment. They're saying, you write well enough. I would even let you write about me. They couldn't say that to anybody else. I mean, could I have gone up to Andre Gide and said, Yes, but when are you going to get serious and start writing about black people? I don't think he would know how to answer that question, just as I don't. He'd say, what? I will if I want to. Or, who are you? What is behind that question is there's the centre, which is white, and then there are these regional blacks or Asians or any sort of marginal people. That question can only be asked from the centre. She would also say, as long as that question seems reasonable, is as long as I won't or can't. The point is, people asking this question are being patronising. They're saying you could come to the centre if you want to. You don't have to stay there on the margins. And I'm saying, yeah, well, I'm gonna stay out here on the margins and let the centre look for me. And a lot of this ties into her rejection of labels as well, because yes, she's writing about the marginalised. Yes, she's not writing about the ostensible centre, but that's not what she's doing primarily. That's not why she's doing it. There's an element of that's why she's doing it, but she's writing sincerely from the heart, from home, from the concerns that are closest to her, from her world. And she said if such questions and such labels and critical focus was put on Joyce or Shakespeare, for example, would we have their great works? She says, I think the reason why everyone still has so much fun with Shakespeare is because he didn't have any literary critic. He was just doing it. And there were no reviews except for people throwing stuff on stage. He could just do it. Toni Morrison went on record as saying she read absolutely everything that people wrote about her. Now, a lot of writers don't do that, and it's very understandable why they would not, because that can mess you up. That can get in your head. Yeah, that can actually end up affecting and damaging your art. It's probably better not to know what people are saying, the negative and the good. A lot of the worst stuff is the good or the stuff that seems to come from a good place but actually does not. But how ludicrous of a question it is clear, because how could Morrison, if she were writing authentically, how could she not write about black people? How could she not write about women? And indeed, both of them intersect for Morrison. Just because she writes about women, for example, does that make her, say, a feminist writer? This is a big thing. When you say Toni Morrison, you probably think, feminist writer. She would overtly reject that. Now, the thing is, in Song of Solomon, she is actually not writing about women. Yes, there are women characters. I think the best characters in the book are women. But here she deliberately challenged herself to write from a male point of view for her central protagonist, who essentially is her surrogate. Although I think Pilate is her best character, I think she really flies and soars as an artist when Pilate speaks. And she said that she didn't want to write Milkman from the outside, from the external, from perception. She wanted to get inside him, wanted to get inside his head and to be able to feel how he really felt, but she refuted the ideological. Now, she is intersectional. Yeah, her views of feminism are deeply influenced by her experience as a black woman, so for her, race and gender intersect. She said that she wasn't particularly interested in discussions of feminism that do not account for race, but ultimately and understandably she would resist these labels. She said that she just wanted to tell the stories of the kinds of people, the kinds of women, for example, that she grew up knowing, the kinds of women in her family. In a Salon interview about her novel Paradise, she talks about why she refuses to call it a feminist novel. She says, I would never write any ist. I don't write ist novels. In order to be as free as I possibly can in my own imagination, I can't take positions that are closed. Everything I've ever done in the writing world has been to expand articulation rather than to close it, to open doors sometimes, not even closing the book. She wants to leave the endings open for reinterpretation, revisitation, and a little ambiguity. I detest and loathe those categories, she says. I think it's off-putting to some readers who may feel that I'm involved in writing some kind of feminist tract. I don't subscribe to patriarchy, and I don't think it should be substituted with matriarchy. I think it's a question of equitable access and opening doors to all sorts of things. But regardless of that, she says, I think I merged the two words, black and feminist, growing up because I was surrounded by black women who were very tough and very aggressive and who always assumed they had to work and rear children and manage homes. They had enormously high expectations of their daughters and they cut no quarter with us. It never occurred to me that that was feminist activity. She says, my mother would walk down to the theatre in that little town, the theatre that had just opened, to make sure they weren't segregating the population, black on this side, white on that side. And as soon as it opened up, she would go in there first and see where the usher put her, and then she would look around and complain to someone. That was just daily activity for her and the men as well. Similar to her rejection of feminism, though she is still considered a feminist writer, many of her thematic preoccupations and concerns have seen her identified as a Marxist, though she herself is not identified as such. Why? Because her stories are typically concerned with socio-economic hardships and how they are intertwined with race, in the same way that gender and race are bound up, race and power and wealth are bound up too. And we see in Song of Solomon, for example, we see an exploration of poverty and economic disenfranchisement. We see the theme of exploitation of labour, and this was a work that could be read as something of a critique of the capitalist system. Her books are all about seeking for meaning and value, human value, beyond the merely material, beyond power and beyond wealth. Now, just because Toni Morrison resists labels, however, that doesn't mean she's not unapologetically writing black literature. Talking about her craft, she would say, I wanted to write literature that was irrevocably, indisputably black. Not because its characters were, or because I was, but because it took as its creative task and sought as its credentials those recognised and verifiable principles of black art. In a Paris review, she would be asked, how do black writers write in a world that is dominated by and informed by their relationship to a white culture? And Morrison would say, by trying to alter language, simply to free it up, not to repress it or confine it, but to open it up. She would point to her short story, Recitative. Again, I'll link this in the resources at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, which is about two little girls in an orphanage. One's white and the other's black, but the reader doesn't know which is white and which is black. I use class codes, but no racial codes. In Unspeakable Things Spoken, Toni Morrison would say that often with black literature, it's what's not there that's significant. So subtext is massively important in African American literature. We see that on the symbolic level of not Dr. Street. We see that with the character of Pilate. When you meet her, you'll discover that one of her defining traits is that she does not have a navel. There's this idea of being defined by absence. But at the same time, when it comes to African American literature, Henry Louis Gates Jr. would talk about the African American cultural practice of signifying. Essentially, he would stipulate that African American literature is not that different from American literature penned by white writers. They use the same conventions, the generic conventions, for example, the convention of the Bildungsroman, yeah? Song of Solomon's a Bildungsroman, like Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, that's a Bildungsroman. It's a coming-of-age story. They just, with African American writers, they just subvert it and they twist it and they add their own ornaments and comments and they make it uniquely their own, but ultimately there is more in common with the African American writers and the white American writers than is not in common. Toni Morrison would also emphasize the group nature of African American art and its communal practice. She would say that the characteristics of black art forms emphasizes the group nature of art, emphasizes its functionality and its improvisational nature, its relationship to audience performance. What's interesting about Morrison is that although she rejects labels, rejects political identification, in the same breath she also does outlay her political purpose. And in the 70s and 80s she presided over the conversation of canon revision. This was a huge discussion in the academic world, this idea of revising the canon. This was a response to the new critical school that saw basically the only measure of worth for a work of literature as aesthetic merit, yeah, the art for art's sake argument. And Morrison would say that it's not just aesthetic merit. Yes, there's that. Yes, you need that. But she would also say that books can and should be political, and they should have a political, communal, functional driving force. Now, personally, I think that great books are those that have a message. Yeah, Ralph Ellison would say that all novels are protest novels. Yeah, Dostoevsky wrote protest novels, but he was just protesting the human condition. I think it's great to have a message, and I do think art can have a social function. I'm not sure how much I believe it's possible to create great art that has its social function as its primary and has the aesthetic or cognitive power, although one could argue that the social purpose is part of the cognitive power if you're running through these philosophical ideas, these sociological ideas. I think if you put the political purpose at the top and do not pay attention to the building blocks of narrative, prose quality, character development, and that sort of thing, then you get into territory where what you're reading isn't art. Now, when it comes to the writings of Toni Morrison, we can see that the reason why these books work is because they do not sacrifice the quality of the narrative and the characterization for the social purpose. If you get to know the characters, if you live in their world, if you find their argument compelling, if you find the way the writer discourses in her own unique voice compelling, then you will take on that social purpose. You'll think through those deep themes of the human condition, which does very often touch on the political too. So in this idea of revising the canon, she wasn't saying we reject aesthetic merit when it comes to evaluating the literary quality of a work. She's just saying that there are other criteria, and one of them is a social communal function, and she saw her readers as a village, as a group, as a collective. And on her writing being communicative, communal, and ultimately political, Morrison would say, if anything I do in the way of writing novels or whatever I write isn't about the village or the community or about you, then it is not about anything. I am not interested in indulging myself in some private, closed exercise of my imagination that fulfills only the obligation of my personal dreams, which is to say, yes, the work must be political. But she would also say in a 1990 essay called Home that her political aim was creating a world in which race does not matter. And she ultimately saw the artist's role in the community as being that of teaching the art of interpretive agency. So we're a collective, but we are emboldened to individuals comprising the collective, come to our own conclusions as to the merits of a work. Morrison would say the reader, as narrator, asks the questions the community asks. The Afrocentric perspective really does emphasise the community, and we can see this illustrated in the African proverb of "it takes a village to raise a child." Now, I would like to close off our discussion today by just reading you a little something from Toni Morrison's foreword to Song of Solomon, because I think this will really inspire you to dig into this book. I absolutely love her foreword to this book. The book is dedicated to her father, with the hope the fathers may soar and the children may know their names. In her foreword she says, "I have long despised artists' chatter about muses, voices that speak to them and enable a vision, the source of which they could not otherwise name. I thought of muses as inventions to protect one's insight, to avoid questions like, where do your ideas come from? Or to escape inquiry into the fuzzy area between autobiography and fiction. I regarded the mystery of creativity as a shield erected by artists to avoid articulating, analysing, or even knowing the details of their creative process, for fear it would fade away. Writing Song of Solomon destroyed all that. I had no access to what I planned to write about until my father died. In the unmanageable sadness that followed, there was none of the sibling wrangling, guilt or missed opportunities or fights for this or that memento. Each of his 4 children was convinced that he loved her or him best. He had sacrificed greatly for one, risking his house and his job. He took another to baseball games over whole summers where they lay in the grass, listening to a portable radio, talking, evaluating the players on the field. In the company of one, his firstborn, he always beamed and preferred her cooking over everyone else's, including his wife's. He carried a letter from me in his coat pocket for years and years, and drove through blinding snowstorms to help me out. Most important, he talked to each of us in language cut to our different understandings. He had a flattering view of me as someone interesting, capable, witty, smart, high-spirited. I did not share that view of myself and wondered why he held it. But it was the death of that girl, the one who lived in his head, that I mourned when he died. Even more than I mourned him, I suffered the loss of the person he thought I was. I think it was because I felt closer to him than to myself that after his death I deliberately sought his advice for writing the novel that continued to elude me. What are the men you have known really like? He answered. Whatever it's called, muse, insight, inspiration, the dark finger that guides, bright angel, it exists, and in many forms I have trusted it ever since. And I'd like to say thank you so much for watching today. Join us at the Hardcore Literature Book Club for a deep read-through of Toni Morrison's masterpiece, Song of Solomon, over at patreon.com/hardcore literature. As Toni Morrison said, your reading should be a communal experience. Yeah, your readership, a writer's readership, is like a village. So we are going to be drawing from the communal power. We are going to be crowdsourcing meaning, and we are going to be discussing Toni Morrison's great novel along the way with a lecture series. And our lectures, as usual, will be coming out on alternating weekends. We are going to be reading Song of Solomon into the autumnal months, but not only that, we are also going to be appreciating some great epic poetry. Last year we read John Milton's Paradise Lost. This year we are going to be reading together Dante's Inferno. So we are going to one weekend talk about Song of Solomon, the next we'll talk about Dante's Inferno, and then we'll be back to Song of Solomon, and this will be the pattern that takes us into autumn. So this weekend coming we're going to have an introductory lecture on Dante, and I'm very excited for this one. There's a lot of excitement in the book club about Dante and also for Toni Morrison. At time of recording we have just wrapped up our last big read, which was David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, and that was an extraordinary experience. If you're interested in checking that out, then all of the lectures are available on demand at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We also just had a discussion on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was a lot of fun. Our Shakespeare project is still ongoing. We're reading the complete works of Shakespeare in chronological order, and our next play up for discussion this month is Pericles. We also recently read through a bunch of Franz Kafka's short stories, and many readers said that was one of the greatest reading experiences they've had with the club. And we also have an incredibly extensive back catalogue of bookish reads, read-throughs and lectures. So not only can you read live with us as the lectures come out in real time, and you can keep pace with the lectures if you like, or you can go at your own pace, but you can also go into the back catalogue and you can enjoy lectures on works by James Joyce, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Victor Hugo, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Steinbeck, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Pynchon, and many, many more. Thank you again so much for reading today. If you've read Song of Solomon before, or you've read the works of Toni Morrison, then let us know your thoughts. Let us know what you made of the work and what advice you would give for first-time readers. And indeed, if this is your first reading of this masterpiece, then what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to? What preconceptions do you have? Let us know your thoughts. And thank you so much again for being here with me and for sharing your love of great literature with us. I appreciate you deeply, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy reading, and bye-bye for now.